let's get started with Connecticut. Now, this is the state that a lot of people point to, those of us that live here in Massachusetts, and some of my comrades that live in New York. We kind of refer to Connecticut as the state that you drive through to get to Boston, or the state that you drive through to get to New York City. I'm not kidding. I'm not kidding. And listen, there are things to do in Connecticut, but for the most part, it's pretty much suburban. Well, you have some exceptions, like New Haven is a little bit urban. You have Yale there. But for the most part, Connecticut is pretty much suburban, and it's also expensive, just like Massachusetts. So let's get started with the big C. Connecticut. How do ballot initiatives work in this beautiful state? Connecticut does not allow its voters the option to place initiatives on the ballot, be they to pass their own laws or ratify their own amendments to the Connecticut Constitution. Only the legislature can pass laws independent of voter involvement and place initiatives on the ballot using a legislative referred constitutional amendment for voters to ratify, amending the legislative initiatives within the Connecticut Constitution. So this is another one of those states where it's really not up to the voters to put initiatives on the ballot. This is done through the state legislature. So let's go to Connecticut question number 1. Allow for early voting amendment. Now, this did pass by 60.40%. Roger Meadows put a note here that says it does not say how many days. It just leaves it up to lawmakers to decide. So let's get into that. Now, a yes vote supported amending the state constitution to authorize the state legislature to provide by law for in-person early voting before an election. Let's talk about that for a second. I think every state should allow this, and they don't. We do have it here in Massachusetts, and I always do early voting. I never wait till the day of because the line's going to be longer. So I do try to do it earlier. And I think everyone should have this opportunity because a couple of reasons. Not everyone gets election day off. That's just how it is. That's the reality, especially a lot of people that are working class. You're not guaranteed to have that day off. It's also not a holiday here in the United States so that everyone can go out and vote. So this is where early voting comes in handy because let's say you do have a couple of days off that is not on election day. Well, you can go ahead and vote early and not have to worry about trying to ask your boss if you can have that day off. Because the reality is, let's say you work at a restaurant, you're a waitress or you're a bartender. Look, they can't let everybody have that day off or the restaurant isn't going to open. The restaurant still has to operate. So this is kind of a reality check for people who may be in like these PMC spaces, which is professional managerial class, where they may have these companies that just give everybody that day off. For people who are working class that work at these restaurants, that work at retail stores, it's not guaranteed. And most of them don't automatically get that day off because, again, restaurants have to operate. They still have to open. And same thing with retail stores as well. So this did pass. And the supporters were State Representative James Maroney, House Minority Leader Vincent Caldalora, State House or Speaker of the House, Matthew Ritter, House Majority Leader Jason Rojas, State Rep Stephanie Thomas, and Secretary of State Denise Merrill. Who did not agree with this? State Representative Gail Mastro Francesco. So he did not agree. He or she, don't want to make an assumption here. And the comment that they gave is that the bill was too broad. So she said early voting must be done in the right way. There must be protections in place. There must be checks and balances in there. Until we do that, or at least make a step in the right direction to do that, I do not support this. Well, sorry for you, Gail, because it did pass. So that's that. Eric said, bad, Gail. Sorry, Gail. All right. So that is Connecticut. So that was the only one that they had this year. So shout out to C-Town. Again, the state that you drive through to get to Boston and to get to New York City. Moving on to Florida. Now, Florida is a little bit different. Florida is a little bit eccentric here. For those of you that live in Florida, I know some of you do. Citizens of Florida may call for a constitutional convention or initiate constitutional amendments through the process of direct initiative, meaning successful petition drives bypass Florida legislature and go directly on the ballot for voters to vote on for ratification to their constitution. So Florida is a direct state. My state, Massachusetts, we haven't gotten to it yet because we're going in alphabetical order, but my state, Massachusetts, is indirect, which means that we cannot bypass the legislature. We have to still go through the legislature. So it's actually more difficult to pass ballot measures in Massachusetts than in a state like Florida. I just want to put that out there. And I say that because we have still been able to pass progressive policies, even though it's more difficult to do so here. Moving on. The Sunshine State. Florida residents cannot directly initiate legislation or repeal legislation via veto referendum. The Florida state legislature may also place measures on the ballot as legislatively referred constitutional amendments. Florida also has two commissions, the Taxation and Budget Reform Commission and the Constitution Revision Commission, which meets every 20 years and have the power to place amendments on the ballot. When voters file to put an initiative on the ballot, it requires 60% of voters to ratify it. I told you Florida was a little bit eccentric here. Now, why is this different from the other states that I have presented? Remember when I told you that South Dakota actually had a measure that they were trying to pass, the legislators were trying to pass, to make it more difficult for ballot initiatives to pass in South Dakota. They wanted to put forth a measure that required 60% of the vote in order for it to pass, which is more than the majority. So, for example, if you had 55%, that's the majority, but it still wouldn't pass. Luckily, that measure failed in South Dakota, and so they don't have to reach that 60%. However, in Florida, you do. Let's go on. So I just want to say this again for people who may be confused. In Florida, in order for a ballot measure to pass, you have to have 60% of the vote. If you do not, even if you had like 56%, even though that's the majority, it still does not pass. That's important for people to know. When the Florida legislature wishes to put a constitutional amendment before voters on the ballot using a legislatively referred constitutional amendment, a 60% vote is required in both chambers of the Florida legislature. So that's another thing that can make it a little bit more difficult there. It also has to reach that 60% in both chambers of the legislature. Then another 60% is required from the voters. So a little bit more difficult in the sense that you need to reach that 60%, but a little bit easier when compared to Massachusetts because they don't have to, again, it's a direct initiative. It is not indirect. Here's a note here from Roger Meadows. No initiatives filed by the voters made it on the 2022 ballot. Only the ones put before the voters by the Florida legislature made it to the ballot. So that's important to note. There's a single subject rule. Florida has a single subject rule. Each proposed measure must address only one subject, except measures limiting the power of government to raise revenue. So you can't combine multiple issues as one ballot measure in Florida. Now, let's get on to the measures that they did put forth. So let's scoot on down to that. Florida Amendment 1 disregard flood resistance improvements in property value assessments measure. This ballot measure failed. The no vote was 42.74%. And again, remember, Florida requires 60%. So it failed. A yes vote supported authorizing the state legislature to pass laws prohibiting flood-resistant improvements to a home from being taken into consideration when determining a property's assessed value for property tax purposes. Here's a note here from Roger. In other words, no property tax increase for making needed home improvements that would make your home/property more flood resistant. Florida is also known to some as the hurricane state. Let's face it, they do get hit every year with hurricanes, but people that live there, they know that. They know these hurricanes are coming every year. What they're trying to tell you here is that if you were to, let's say there was a hurricane, and let's say your property had some type of damage from the hurricane, then you make home improvements to make your house better, to fix some of the damage that may have been done. And sometimes that can be flood damage, right? So I'm gonna go ahead and tell you, if you move to Florida, maybe you should get some flood insurance. I'm just gonna tell you, just be real. My friend lost their home last year because of flooding. Any repairs that you make to your home or your property, what they're trying to say here is that that is not going to increase your property tax. No property tax increase for making those improvements. So that's important to note. In Florida, property tax rates are set by counties, school districts, cities, and special districts. Homes in Florida are assessed at just value, which is market value, minus the homestead exemption. Every primary residence is eligible for a $25,000 homestead exemption. Another $25,000 homestead exemption is applied to homesteads that have assessed value of more than $50K up to $75K. The homestead exemption reduces the taxable value of a property. So that's important to note there. Again, when you live in these states or these cities that have flood zones, when you move into those homes and the insurance companies come by, they usually send a representative and ask you, would you like to purchase flood insurance for your home? Say yes. Say yes, because like I said, like I've known people that have turned that down and they said, I'm not going to be put in that situation. And then they get hit with a hurricane and they have flood damage and they're kind of screwed. So just an FYI. We'll see if I have time to go to the video. Who supported it? State Representative Linda Cheney and Florida House Speaker Chris Sprouls. And who was opposed? The Brevard County Democratic Party, Lake County Democratic Party, Marion County Democratic Party, Orange County Democratic Party, Seminole County, Sumter County, Volusia County is here twice for some reason, but Democratic Party for those counties were opposed. Now, Roger put a note here and said, just keep in mind that the majority of voters wanted this at 57 to 58%. But because Florida can only pass amendments and not laws, plus cross the 60% threshold to amend it, didn't pass. Seeing that Florida is a no income tax state, like a child who has moved out, who no longer has the safety net of their parents to depend on, and therefore must work on increasing their personal income. States like Florida are the parent and the municipalities are the child who has moved out. So they are solely dependent on that property tax to fund their municipal government. Therefore, municipalities and states with no state income tax should charter public banks. And this goes back to taxes, because there are states, Florida isn't the only one. There are states like Florida, Tennessee is another one that doesn't have a state income tax, but they have to make up for that somewhere, right? So for Florida, it's the property tax. Roger Meadows has a good point here about having a public bank. You could get more of these measures passed when people say, where's the money going to come from? How are you going to pay for it? We don't want to tax the people more. You wouldn't have to worry about that if you had a public bank. Let's go to the second one here. Florida Amendment 2, abolish the Constitution Revision Commission measure. This also failed. The no vote was 46.13%. A yes vote supported abolishing the Florida Constitution Revision Commission, a 37-member commission that meets 20 years to propose changes to the state's constitution and refer them to the statewide ballot for voter approval or rejection. This is interesting. Florida Constitutional Revision Commission is a 37-member commission provided for the state that convenes every 20 years to review and propose changes to the Florida Constitution. The CRC refers constitutional amendments directly to the ballot for a public vote, which makes the commission unique amongst the states. Florida is the only state with a commission that can refer constitutional amendments to the ballot. That's important to note. Who supported this? State Representative Jeff Brandeis. I don't know if it's Brandeis or Bronze. And political parties that supported it, Orange County and Volusia County Democratic parties. No one opposed this measure. And I'm going to the final one here, which is Florida Amendment 3, additional homestead property tax exemption for certain public service workers measure. Now, this did not pass as well. The no vote was 41.32%. A yes vote supported authorizing the Florida State Legislature to provide an additional homestead property tax exemption on $50,000 of assessed value on property owned by certain public service workers, including teachers, law enforcement officers, emergency medical personnel, active duty members of the military, and the Florida National Guard and Child Welfare Service employees. The amendment would have authorized the Florida State Legislature to provide an additional homestead property tax exemption of $50,000 on the assessed value between $100,000 and $150,000, exempting that amount from all taxes other than school district taxes for property owned by certain public service workers. Public service workers who could have qualified for the additional exemption would have included K through 12 classroom teachers, law enforcement, emergency medical technicians, firefighters, paramedics, active duty members of the military, and Florida's National Guard, and the state child welfare service employees. Those receiving the additional exemption would have been required to annually provide proof of full-time qualifying employment. I'm surprised this didn't pass. Pros and cons. So a note here from Roger Meadows. In 2010, here they have approved exemptions specifically for our military. Maybe the next one should be piecemeal. One for K through 12 public school teachers, 14 EMT workers and paramedics, one for firefighters, one for social workers, etc. Because this one that failed this year had a lot of people in there that one might not agree with. If you are anti-cop, you might have voted against it, not because you hate teachers or EMTs and paramedics. This is a good point. If you're pro-charter school, you might have voted against it because you don't like the teachers' unions. Again, a public bank would solve this. This is another reason why I think sometimes it's best just to have these as single issues. I think Roger Meadows was spot on there. Maybe they should have separated those. I don't know, but it's a good point. Really good point. So that was Connecticut and Florida. Let me go to some of these comments. Good Cookie said military and police should not be included in that. They get government housing allowance. Yes, I was going to mention that. So I don't know how it is in every state in the US, but I know in states that I've lived in, they do get these allowances. So like my dad was former military. Yes, they do get a housing allowance. So they're kind of covered there. Also, if you live on base, then you don't have to worry about that anyway. And the police officers as well. I know when I lived in North Carolina, police officers also got a housing allowance. So that's a good point. This goes back to what Roger mentioned, is that maybe these should have been separated and not together. That's right. Right, Soul. Yes, single issues. And Soul, I think you're in Florida. So yeah. Yeah. Good Cookie said, yep, that's why I would be against it. Yeah, I don't think that was a good idea for them to do it that way.